Welcome. I'm really excited this afternoon that we are sharing an opportunity for a conversation around the urban exodus and the impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic had throughout rural Ontario. As was mentioned, my name is Ryan Gibson. I'm a research chair with the Gateway Centre of Excellence in Rural Health and the Lieber Professor of Regional Economic Development at the University of Guelph. The Gateway Centre of Excellence in Rural Health is a community-based nonprofit that aims to promote health and quality of life of rural residents through research, education, and communication. If you're not familiar with Gateway's many activities, I encourage you to explore their website after our discussion this afternoon. Today's lecture emerges from research led by the University of Guelph. The University of Guelph's campus is situated on the ancestral, traditional, unceded, and treaty lands and territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Adirondack people. We acknowledge and honor the Indigenous people who have been stewards of the lands and the waters that sustain us all. As you listen to today's lecture, I encourage everyone to recognize and to reflect on your own connections to the land, relations with Indigenous people, and opportunities for enhanced reconciliation. The impacts of COVID-19 pandemic were and continue to be profound. Although all communities have been impacted, these impacts vary greatly by community. One of the elements that we frequently heard in the news, as I'm sure people are familiar, was the migration of urban residents to rural places. And today's lecture explores this reality, its challenges, and its opportunities that were experienced throughout rural Ontario. I'm delighted today to introduce our lecture participants. We're going to start with a presentation by Sara Epp, who is a professor in the University of Guelph School of Environmental Design and Rural Development. And following Sara's presentation, we'll have a panel discussion with Chris Fullerton, who is a professor of geography and tourism studies at Brock University, Ellen Sinclair, who is the executive director of the Rural Ontario Institute, and Scott Taylor, who is the director of planning with Grey County. I have no doubt people will have lots of questions, reflections, and experiences, and we encourage you to ask any questions through the chat box feature here in Zoom. At the conclusion of our panel discussion, we will have an opportunity to pick up all of those comments and to provide some feedback. To those that are ongoing attendees of Gateway's lecture series, a reminder that they offer a certificate at the end of each semester for those who have a perfect attendance to recognize your commitment to and involvement with this educational series. But with that, I'm going to turn the proverbial floor over to Sara to share recent research findings on the urban exodus taking place across Ontario.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that introduction, Ryan, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to share some information. I'm going to stress before I get into the presentation that this is 10 minutes consolidated from something that could probably be a 3-hour lecture, which nobody probably wants to hear about for that long. So it's going to be a lot of information, very short snippets of information, and I'm sure much more that you want to know, which is always exciting. So I'll note right now, I'm always happy to chat at some point if anyone wants to reach out to get more information. The study is ongoing, so it hasn't quite wrapped yet, but there's a lot of data here and a lot of work that's still going to happen this year. So this is sort of just a little bit of a snapshot into things that we've done so far. And so a really quick acknowledgement of the research team being myself, Dr. Ryan Gibson, Dr. Chris Fullerton, and a recent graduate of the Rural Planning and Development Program, Natasha Gaudio-Harrison, who did the majority of the data analysis and actually put this presentation together for me. So super excited that she was able to assist with that, even though she isn't here to present today. So the project itself came about for a number of reasons, but I think most importantly, we heard during the pandemic a lot of anecdotal information through print media, through online media, through so many different sources about this seeming exodus of urban residents to more rural places. And really from the start of the pandemic, we'll say March 2020, there was this sense of escaping the ills of urban life and going to more rural places between 2020 and 2022. And we heard things like rural places offered more space, whether that was just getting out into nature, whether that was properties. There was a perception that rural places were much more affordable places to be. And then, of course, this idea of escaping the ills, so-called ills of the city. But there was really no certain facts of this migration. A lot of it really was sort of anecdotal things we were hearing, and then what the impacts were post-pandemic. And so through the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance, which is a partnership between OMAFA and the University of Guelph, this sort of research question was posed. We applied for it. We got funding, which was fantastic. And the initial results are what I'm going to share today. So we did have 4 fairly broad objectives. Number 1, and I think this is probably for all of our projects as they impact rural communities, was to support rural communities and rural stakeholders within Ontario. The second was to gauge the current situation regarding COVID-induced urban to rural migration. And we've highlighted central, eastern, southwestern, and northern. So the goal was really to cover the entire province, recognizing that experiences varied depending on where you were within Ontario. Third was to better understand the impacts of increased urban to rural migration. And then fourth was to identify a number of best practices for a variety of different stakeholders. We do know, as a little bit of background, and I won't spend much time on this because I think the survey results are probably the more juicy pieces, is that there has been a growth in rural communities. And so the quote here is that the latest census showed more rural CSDs experience positive population growth in the 5 years leading to 2021 than any time since 1996. Almost doubling, which I think is incredible to think of. And that's sort of before some of this really COVID-induced migration I think we were seeing happen. So we already know there's this resurgence in many rural places, and really an understanding, I think, that the pandemic really exaggerated, exasperated, frustrated, a whole host of different terms we can use, but fueled, I think, some of that migration quite significantly. And so as one component of this project was a survey that we shared, and it went out to senior municipal professionals across the province, so CAOs, planners, economic development professionals, clerks, as well as elected officials. It was multiple choice and open-ended, and it really focused on this perception versus reality component. So we asked some questions that were about perceptions of change, and then also questions that sort of required respondents to fact check a little bit and make sure that some of those changes were in fact happening. Although we can learn a lot from perceptions, sometimes it's helpful to know that there is data demonstrating that some of these things have actually happened. And so we had 87 complete responses that did come from across the province, which is fantastic. And that data will then inform our case studies we'll be doing later this year. So one of the first things we asked municipal professionals about was their perception on population growth, to understand if there was a perception versus reality piece in the migration trends we were seeing. 59% of respondents did note that the population change they perceived was validated by the census. So a majority of respondents did perceive that population growth was happening, and the census did validate it. So that was really helpful to see. It wasn't strictly a perception-based response. We also asked respondents about some of the trends they were witnessing to understand sort of a general profile of the types of people migrating to rural communities. Urbanites seeking a rural lifestyle was absolutely the most common trend they witnessed. Maybe not surprising. I think that was one of our assumptions going into this. And it was a descriptor that we could also see applied to other groups, such as retirees, remote workers, and cottagers that were moving to rural places full time. So they all sort of fit under that umbrella, but it really was the profile that wasn't surprising and was absolutely validated by respondents. We also asked respondents about push and pull factors that they are witnessing among people migrating to and from their communities. The most interesting outcome was the pull factors, because it highlighted that access to green space seemed to be the most important factor to incoming residents. So those that were moving from urban places to a rural community, that access to green space was one of the largest, if not the largest by a significant margin there, pull for rural communities. Affordability, availability of housing, those were also top reasons. And again, this gets into some of those perceptions and assumptions we had early on. And this is relative, though, to housing found in the cities. So housing in a city, selling a house for $2 million, moving to a rural community, spending $800,000 on a house may sound affordable to that person who's now moved, but that affordability of the existing house in the rural community, I think, is something that we should still sort of tease away at and get a better understanding of. And these factors really do continue to be a challenge for locals. They take away from housing stock, they impact rural communities, they impact affordability, of course. And so the push and pull pieces have to be something that we really do consider. We also asked about some impacts to the community itself in response, and we were interested to know whether respondents had witnessed any conflicts between new and existing residents. And this really came from the media that was coming out between 2020 and 2022 about conflict. And maybe not unsurprising, 65% responded that they had witnessed conflicts happening in the community. And so some of these quotes, NIMBYism was a big one. Tourists versus residents was something that respondent had provided. There was a lot of different opinions on best approaches to tackling social issues such as homelessness, and that was brought in with more urban perceptions or opinions. And then complaints about traffic and losing the small town feel. And this one is always really interesting to me because that small town feel is a pull for residents moving there, but you lose that small town feel as we attract more and more population. And so those complaints were absolutely happening in some of these rural places. Respondents were asked about social and economic impacts as well, which I'll be going through quite quickly, as well as impacts on housing, because we know it's an incredibly hot topic right now and will be for quite some time. And here were the three that rose to the top. So we saw increase in the use of outdoor public space. So we see the green space, outdoor space coming up again as quite high. Decrease in mental health of community members. And I think that's something we could probably say pandemic-wide was an issue, regardless of where you were. And decrease in food security, which were all very much concerning social impacts. Some interesting quotes here, and I won't read all of them, but the second one I think is really interesting. Youth have been most profoundly impacted. There is a real sense of hopelessness amongst 15 to 21-year-olds. Volunteers have not returned in their pre-COVID numbers. Use of the food bank and hidden hunger has absolutely skyrocketed. We see more people living in tents or cars with virtually zero supports in our small rural community. And attached to that, the next one, which was a separate quote, was our older generation of community volunteers has aged out and not been replaced by a new generation. So while a younger generation may be moving into these rural communities from urban places, the level of volunteerism that was seen before the pandemic has not been maintained with new residents. It's absolutely gone away, decreased with the sort of retirement, if I can use that word, of volunteers. Housing impacts, probably not a surprise here. And again, I think this is something we see really across the country, but increase in cost of real estate and rental accommodation, increase in unhoused population, and then an increase in new housing construction, as well as the cost of building materials. So it was fantastic to see more houses being built, but the cost of those houses has been going up significantly as well. And so we see those who have never been or underhoused are facing homelessness due to the cost of utilities, lack of pensions and wages keeping pace, lack of attainable housing, loss of a spouse, influx of newcomers with city expectations. Homelessness was next to non-existent. However, it is now available or is now visible. And lastly, we were already gentrifying. The pandemic accelerated what was on the horizon. And I think that one is really, really telling that this process was already happening in this community, and the pandemic really just sped it up. Some economic impacts related to support for local business, as well as new business startups, and a few quick quotes there. Rapidly increasing population, demanding city-type services in a rural setting, and no additional human resources to satisfy these demands. And online shopping during COVID restrictions changed retail patterns, making it more difficult for local businesses to remain afloat. This was already occurring pre-COVID and is not necessarily significantly correlated to the pandemic itself, but I think we did see a lot of business closures during the pandemic and many empty storefronts as a result. There are opportunities. I'm going to go to challenges after this, but there is some positive stuff. So we see an increase in community diversity, which is nice. New housing construction is happening, and there have been new businesses and new business expansions as a result of hybrid work and increased telecommunications, which I think is a win for rural communities. Some challenges, though, are related to rental accommodation. Costs have increased and availability has absolutely decreased. Housing availability in general has become more limited, and then access to healthcare as well has become more limited. Again, not easy enough to say that that's directly related to the pandemic, but it absolutely has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so the next steps for this project is to finalize the survey results, get our case studies completed across Ontario, again, looking to have representation from all of the different parts of the province because experiences were very different, get into our findings, recommendations, and then our final report, which we will share broadly. This is all happening in 2025, so it's a really exciting time frame, I think, for this project, and we'll wrap at the end of the year. So exciting to sort of tease some of these findings right now. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll turn it back to Ryan with all of that information to go into the panel.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that overview of the survey itself and the findings that were emerging. In the chat box, I stuck a link to the Urban Exodus Research Project, where you can find more information, and some of these resources will be available there in due course. And as Sarah mentioned, many will be forthcoming over the coming weeks and months ahead. So there was a lot of information in that presentation, lots to unpack, lots of really interesting findings, and lots to think about on that front. And so I'll maybe turn now to our three panelists. We're excited to have Chris, Ellen, and Scott with us. I've asked each of them a really broad question around what are your experiences and reflections on COVID-related migration in rural Ontario. I anticipate each of you might take a very different approach to it, and that is exciting on its own front. But I will kind of yield the floor to each of you to think about your own observations. You might wish to comment on things Sarah maybe has posed as some of the findings, share impacts from COVID-related migration that you've been hearing from your members or organizations or clients. If you have got interesting stories, by all means, feel free to share that, as well as how your organization might be in addressing these COVID-related migration issues that are emerging or opportunities. And maybe if I can, I'll put Chris on the spot first, and then maybe turn to Ellen and then to Scott on that front.
Sure, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so as mentioned earlier, I'm a part of the research team working on this project with Sarah and Ryan and our army of graduate student research assistants and such. And I think, you know, as a starting point, I guess I could say that I was quite interested to see, because we've also looked at StatsCan census data and media content and so on in conjunction with the survey. Was just how widespread of a phenomenon the COVID era migration was across Ontario. So historically, we've always seen sort of rural urban fringe communities undergoing population growth just due to the spillover from the cities and suburbs. But this truly was a province-wide phenomenon. Places that, as Sarah showed on one of the slides, you know, typically experienced population decline on a slow and steady basis through the intercensal periods. Saw an absolute turnaround, where for the first time in many census periods, they were actually seeing an influx of newcomers. Whether it was a small community of 400 people going up to 480, whether it was a town of 5,000 going up to 6,500, it was everywhere, including the northwestern part of the province, in the Lake of the Woods region, through to eastern Ontario, around Ottawa and Kingston and such, and then down, of course, into Niagara and southwestern Ontario too. So it's truly a province-wide thing. The other thing, though, is of course the census doesn't give us a complete picture, because of course the census most recently was done in May 2021. We were only about 14 months into the pandemic. So one of the things I think we're going to be really looking forward to, not as part of this project, but afterwards, are the results of the May 2026 census in terms of what we see there. Whether the COVID era migration was a short-lived phenomenon, whether we're starting to see people relocate back to the cities due to the return to work orders, those sorts of things. But the other thing that I just want to mention quickly before passing on to my fellow panelists is one of the things that we've also noticed in the research, and what the survey that Sarah provided the overview of, was their first real look at an internal perspective on the impacts of the pandemic era migration in rural communities. When we did a media content analysis, we looked at about over 100 newspaper articles along with this work, and the focus was almost entirely on the perspectives of the city dwellers who were moving, why they were moving, that sort of thing. And there's very little attention paid to the actual experiences of the rural communities from their perspective, right? And it was an interesting quote from one I just wanted to share. During all the conversations with realtors and with urban to rural migrants, there was a big focus on sort of that inward move, but rural people were being talked about as if they're just part of the landscape. Right. In other words, not really thinking deeply about how the communities are being impacted and such. And so I'm especially curious to hear from my fellow panelists who are more directly entrenched in rural communities in Ontario, what they think about those sorts of things. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for those comments, Chris, and some really insightful information there to think about. Maybe we'll turn to Ellen to share some reflections. And I'd also encourage you, Ellen, maybe to share a line or two around who is the Rural Ontario Institute, in case there's folks on the lecture that are not familiar with ROI.
Well, thanks very much, Ryan. The Rural Ontario Institute has, we've been around since 2010. Before we were ROI, we were the Ontario Rural Council and the Centre for Rural Leadership. So two organizations came together 15 years ago and created ROI. And we do several things in the interests of rural Ontario and rural Ontarians. We develop leaders, rural leaders. We do that through the delivery of some leadership training programs for agriculture champions and for rural youth. Also, we deliver leadership training to different interest groups and commodity groups, including the agricultural societies in Ontario. So the Ontario Association of Agricultural Societies and ROI work in partnership to help raise the capacity of those not-for-profits in our rural communities. In addition to the leadership programs that we deliver, we also, we're very proud to make rural Ontario data, research, and analysis available to our rural constituents. So we have dashboards on our website that really drill down to the local data in each community at that micro level. So we've got a community well-being dashboard there. And we have a rural housing information system on our website as well. So so we develop leaders, we inform decision makers through those dashboards, and we connect communities. And so this kind of connection with rural stakeholders, rural communities is sort of our lifeblood. So Rural Ontario Institute's really interested in this kind of conversation and certainly in this kind of research. And so I'll go to the question, which is, what has ROI observed? First of all, thank you for your presentation, Sarah. That was so interesting. And every time I had a question, you answered it. So I was going to say things like, really, housing affordability in rural Ontario? Like, I live in Mono, and if you're not familiar, I'm sort of an hour northwest of Toronto. So we're just above that GTA boundary. And my gosh, our housing, average housing went up by 40%. So really, but you're right, because if I can sell my Toronto house for 2 million and buy something here for 800,000, then yeah, everything is relative. I think that the piece in the study, though, that really impacted me was the whole issue around perceptions. And I know that you're very careful to say these are perceptions, although a lot of it is backed up with the stats. We also have, in our conversations with our constituents and our partners, the perception that there's been an influx into rural communities, and there's been this change in the rural landscape, and people are sort of a little bit anxious about that. Like, what's happening to our rural our rural sensitivity, our rural culture, what's happening to our communities. But I keep going back to that. It is a perception, and we too are waiting for the next census to sort of confirm that indeed rural grew, or there was a big bump in rural communities over COVID, because we also know that rural Ontario has been growing anyway, whether COVID or not, and so rural has had to face that growth and that influx of migrants, before COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID, as has all of Ontario. So our urban communities grew as well. It's just way more noticeable in rural Ontario. Just a personal, sorry, I just thought, personally, I live in the country. We are on a family property here that and my cousin has a sort of a piece out of that property, and she lives in Toronto, and of course in COVID came right up and ensconced herself in her property up here. So I witnessed that firsthand. I've witnessed others sort of migrating or refugees from the city during COVID. It was a safer place. It felt safer to be in the, you know, away from the crowds. But she went right back, right, as soon as it was safe. So that was not that was a temporary thing. I'll leave it at that, Ryan, and thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, those are great reflections, Ellen, in terms of that. And I think a really nice comment there around that anxiousness that some communities are feeling, whether that's real or perceived, around kind of change in the global perspective and what that might mean and what that might look like moving forward. I'll remind folks that if you're listening in and you've got a question or a comment, you're more than welcome to put it in the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen, just off the right of center. But right now, we'll maybe turn to Scott for some reflections around kind of your experiences on COVID migration in and around the Grey County neck of the woods, or elsewhere for that matter.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Ryan. And I would echo a lot of the same sentiments as a lot of the other panelists. And certainly similar to what Ellen said, when I was listening to Sarah's presentation, there was a lot of head nodding, like, yep, that rings true, that rings true. So just for those of you that might not be familiar, so I'm from Grey County, and Grey County is largely a rural population, although we do have some wonderful recreational amenities, including large portions of the Niagara Escarpment, the Georgian Bay shoreline, Blue Mountain Ski Resort. So we're known both for our small towns, our small communities, our agricultural base, but also our recreational opportunities. And so Grey pre-pandemic was growing, not at the speed of some of our more urban neighbors, but we were certainly growing. And so from 2016 to 2021 census, we went from 94,000 to 101,000 people. And now sitting in roughly 2025, we estimate we're at about 109,000 people. So it's tough to separate what growth was going to come our way anyway, based on the trend of us growing in the past 10 to 15 years versus that COVID migration. But we definitely did see that bump. And similar to what Ellen said, we saw some of that with a bit of a yo-yo effect, particularly in our more recreational oriented areas like Blue Mountains or the Beaver Valley. We have lots of second homes. So people that maybe live most of the time in the city, but have a ski chalet in the Blue Mountain area or a home in the Beaver Valley. And so in a number of cases, we would see people move up to those second homes. And I think in some cases, they found a way to make it work and are working remotely or part-time from there. And in other cases, once we got through sort of the heart of the pandemic, they decided that maybe full-time rural life wasn't really for them and have gone back to the cities in that regard. But we did see a lot of sort of anecdotal bumps that we can point to that definitely showed that sort of COVID migration early on. Particularly in the school registration I guess that would have been the fall of 2020. We had some local schools that were reporting significantly higher registration rates than you would otherwise expect from natural birth rate or anything like that. So in some cases, there was more portables being installed, things like that. We had anecdotal evidence from some of our wastewater treatment plant operators that would say, you know, normally this time of year, and they were in the recreational communities, we would see this much flow, and we're doubling or tripling that flow right now. So it's not a great statistical base on which to build on, but it pointed to what we were seeing in our communities in terms of more people. And certainly we're definitely seeing some of those conflicts that have been talked about with respect to those that already live in the rural areas or small communities, cherishing that small town feel and way of life. But as I said, we were experiencing some of that beforehand already with the growth. And then certainly one of the other sort of hats I wear is the county planning department also looks after our county forests and our county trails. And I will say, especially during those periods of lockdown or those periods where the borders were shut and we were seeing more domestic tourism, our outdoor recreational amenities were growing beyond belief, so to speak, in terms of, where we had small parking lots or people parking on the roadside to visit trails or amenity areas, that certainly dramatically increased. I would say on some of those outdoor spaces, we've gone back to closer to normal levels in terms of we're not seeing that elevated traffic anymore. But I think there were definitely some that they discovered these jewels during the pandemic when they couldn't travel and continued to use those. And then the final point I'll make is again, just with respect to those housing prices and housing availability. And for those that already owned a second home here and could relocate, that didn't affect them. But for those that were looking to buy in Gray, for the first time that I can remember, we were seeing homes selling for significantly over asking and selling, within a week of being on the market kind of thing. And we used to kind of quaintly think of that as more of a big city experience and not something we experienced in Gray County. But the prices went up. Some of them have leveled a little bit now, but they're certainly way up over what they were pre-pandemic, and it has created challenges for our population, both in terms of availability and people being unhoused in that regard. So I'll turn it back to Ryan now, but certainly happy to weigh in later on.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Scott. And I think it's really quite interesting. It builds well on a number of themes that I think Chris introduced. This notion that the census is only every 5 years from Stats Canada, and a lot of things happen within 5 years. And so some of those indicators that you shared, Scott, around school registrations, wastewater, use of parks and recreation facilities are really telling in terms of the story of what's happening between censuses. But I also think of your story, Ellen, of people moving out of the city into urban areas that might only be there for a few months and that still may not even be captured in some of those indicators like school registrations or wastewater, that we need to be able to find ways to account for as it relates to planning, health services, community services, volunteerism, and all the rest. At this point, I was going to ask our panelists, and I'll include Sara in this, if anyone has kind of some suggestions around, or maybe not suggestions, but ideas or topics that rural communities should be thinking about as they move forward, as it relates to COVID migration. Anything that comes to mind in terms of kind of key topics that they should be thinking about, focusing on, maybe they're already doing, but if they're not doing it already, maybe that they should be thinking about on that front. And then we'll turn to some of the questions and answers that are there. But did anyone have any topics that they think rural communities might want to focus on as they think about COVID migration based on anything that people have said?
Happy to jump in first, maybe, and start the conversation. I think from the survey, a couple things. The first is, and I think it's been brought up a couple of times, just the green space. And so I think for rural communities, that investment in those public spaces, whether the investment is available or not, I think use has gone up significantly. And I suspect in many places it has maintained, if not steadily, sort of kept going up. And so I think that investment is interesting. The traffic comment has come up a bit, and I know there was a comment in the chat, I think, that mentioned traffic too. So infrastructure, I think, is one of those pieces that is so significant and is something where most budgets go anyways, but I think the demand for infrastructure has gone up significantly. And then just back to the volunteer sort of aspect, I think it's so challenging that rural communities rely so heavily on volunteerism. Ryan, you'll know all about charity and donation and all those amazing things that loss, like flagging it many times that volunteer rates have not been replaced since 2020 is, I think, shocking, because so many rural communities depend on volunteers, whether it's for sports teams for kids, whether it's for bringing food to seniors. I think it's just such a big component of the way rural lives work and those social aspects. And so for me, I think those are the critical pieces that have come up in the survey. And I've heard it a lot today too. So I think it's really, really important thing to continue to highlight.
Great. I think I saw Chris reaching for his mic.
Yeah,
There it
I'll
is.
chime in too, please. Thank you. Yeah, and it sort of builds on a lot of what Sara just said, but I think, municipalities, of course, routinely do this, but I think it will prompt or should prompt rural communities across Ontario to look onto their official plans, their land use planning policies, their planning documents, because they, in a lot of cases, I'm assuming their population projections just were completely off because of the unexpected influx of population and such. And so I think, you know, the questions, things like Ellen brought up about, you know, concern for the rural character of the community and that sort of thing. So if it hasn't done so already, I think it's going to be critical for communities to go back to their official plans, which they'll have to update anyway due to other sort of changes in provincial legislation and such. But it's a good time to sort of revisit everything from the community vision and values through to how much land is going to be reserved for future housing development and so on. Because I think in a lot of cases, the official plans that they had in place in 2019 and February 2020 are no longer probably quite as relevant as they should be, given the changes so many have gone through. Thank you.
Maybe just, oh, sorry, Ellen, you go ahead.
That's okay. You go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just to build on what Chris shared. Interestingly enough, the county had planned to do a growth management strategy update in 2020. And so we took that to council and they said, well, is this really the right time to be doing it? But we got council support and we plotted ahead to look at what our growth projections were going to look like for the next 25 years. Because like I said, we were already seeing that sort of increased amount of growth. But the one thing that we committed to as part of that strategy was to revisit it in about 4 years' time. And we've actually just gone out to market for the 2025 edition of the Growth Management Update. Because as Chris said, it really does impact everything you do in planning, from infrastructure planning to land supply to various other things. And so, you know, similar to the comments about the census only being every 5 years, we're really interested to see to what degree was some of that a blip versus to what degree is it going to be sustained growth. And the other thing we really like to dig into further from a planning perspective is what is the nature of that growth? So was that largely retirees choosing to vacate the cities and come to our area? Or was that in some cases young professionals or working age families? And you know, if you think about the impact on things like schools or other services that municipalities would offer, it really does make a big difference. So we're really keen to see how this 2025 update informs us going forward in terms of what that growth horizon will look like.
I'm so interested in both of you made comments about the official planning and the planning for infrastructure and traffic. And from my perspective, I think communities also need to be very really consider that community development piece where that community figures out how to be a welcoming community, so that there aren't those sort of social problems, or, you know, not problems, but just that tension that, you know, between newcomers and those who've lived there for generations. And I mean, the story of rural Ontario is migration and immigration, and we're just continuing, where it's a new chapter. And it doesn't matter where people have come from, whether from the city, whether from outside the province. I think a community really needs to dig deep and decide what kind of community it wants to be. And ideally, it decides it wants to be a welcoming community. And how do you do that? Well, that's up to you as a community. But so as a community or a municipality are they bringing on board those groups that create community? So like not just the business community, but chambers, of course, not-for-profits, faith communities, recreational groups, like all those, the whole fabric of that community needs to be involved in where that community is deciding to go in its planning process.
These are wonderful comments on all of this. And I particularly think around the population changes and the dynamics that are maybe recorded and not recorded, and their implication for funding, as many of the infrastructure, but also social health services are funded based on accounts provided by government. And if the counts are not correct, that has a huge implication on resource allocation for those different services that are in a community on this front. We've got a few questions that have been posed to through the chat box. So I'm just going to pose this, maybe the first one to Sara. And at the same time, I welcome others that are listening in to put their questions into the Q&A box. But I'm wondering if you might speak to issues around traffic, speeding, courtesy, and maybe even broader, could also be around crime, whether those topics emerged in the survey results to date yet in the analysis.
Yeah, traffic, absolutely. Traffic and congestion, which I think in some rural places, increased traffic is very obvious and very quick. There were a few comments around things like roundabouts and feeling the traffic at those sort of natural slowing down points and not recognizing or not maybe understanding the busyness of it. Traffic was definitely the biggest one. Crime didn't come up. I don't recall crime being noted in any of the commentary. I'm just trying to think right now. Traffic was huge. Just access to space in general, I think, was something that came up quite a bit. And then who has access, I think, and this gets into that, the sort of, and this is going off topic a little bit, but we did ask questions. Again, this was the perception versus reality piece about conflict, because we know conflict got played out a lot in the media. It was very us versus them, newcomer versus long-term resident, urban versus rural. There was a lot of versus and sort of dualisms happening. And I did share that stat. I think that like 65% said, yeah, absolutely, there was conflict. And so I think that came out in who has the right to be in rural communities. I think we saw that play out quite a bit, which maybe then plays into that question about courtesy, right? That driving courtesy and speeding. And so I think when the conventions that have been in some small towns, rural places, aren't known or aren't as obvious. I think things like passing tractors and stuff like that, you see that all the time in some rural places, and you know it's somebody who's not familiar with that area should not be passing where they are. I think that's where some of those conflicts sort of come up from as well. And so conflict was huge. And I think some of that plays out into those social norms that some places just have. And if you've been there for some length of time, you've learned those conventions and you know what's sort of a courtesy to follow. Maybe it's not always what people think is appropriate to follow with passing and things like that. But I think those things played out in some of those conflicts, and then just rights to space. And I mean, I have an anecdote I'll share really quickly that wasn't from the research, but I stayed with family in Niagara during the pandemic myself, and we live in an area where it's not safe to walk on the road. You simply don't do it. And so we would drive to a park to be able to access a path. And it became this huge thing. If you can't walk to that path, you shouldn't be using it. And it was very much, this part of the community gets access to it. It was a very wealthy part of the community, and anybody who has to drive there shouldn't be using it because you can't walk there. And so I think there's a lot of that sort of very extreme opinions coming up of who has access to space. And I wouldn't play the lifelong resident card by any means, but it's an interesting thing to think of who has access and understanding how that played into conflict. And then I think also of branding, that public space is public space. It's meant for the public, and there are multiple publics in a place. And so I think some of that has to be, and probably still to this day, needs to be better understood. Totally off topic, Ryan. Sorry about that.
No, wonderful on that front. We've got a few questions here, and I might put maybe Scott on the hot seat here. Chris has shared a wonderful example in her community where residents, where people were urban residents taking advantage of low tax or low interest rates to be able to buy homes, perhaps second homes in rural communities, but then running afoul in terms of Airbnb and short-term accommodations. And I'm wondering, Scott, if you might speak to, is this something that you've encountered maybe in Grey County around urban residents that have maybe moved into the county, purchased a home or a second home, and are now running into scenarios where they're using it for short-term rentals and local bylaws that might be impacting those sorts of options?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I won't say we had a lot of that specific to the pandemic, but it's been a topic on the horizon for a few years now, for sure. And so Grey is made up of 9 member municipalities, particularly those close to, say, Georgian Bay or Blue Mountain or the Beaver Valley. There is a high degree of interest in short-term stays there. And so there's a number of people that own income properties, if you will, that rent them out for short-term accommodations. And some of our municipalities have more prescriptive policies and bylaws in that. And so I don't know, and I could reach out and see whether or not they saw a great increase there in terms of infractions. But I will say, overall, we were seeing sort of increased domestic tourism numbers when people couldn't travel abroad, and certainly anecdotally, a lot of the tourism operators were doing very well. It was kind of a tale of two cities, like either you were doing very, very well or you couldn't even operate kind of thing, which is very sad, and some businesses sadly didn't recover. But I think on the short-term rentals Airbnb side of things, that opportunity/challenge had been growing for a little bit now, and maybe was accelerated by the pandemic. Just to loop back to Sarah's question, one of the things that we saw a lot of was increased conflict between sort of urban drivers and non-urban vehicles like tractors and such. And so we got into having to run billboards and PSAs about share the road, but not sort of your typical share the road with cyclists and pedestrians, but, you know, exercise caution around tractors and harvesting equipment, everything else, and things that maybe for those of us that were born and raised in rural Ontario, we've just kind of gotten used to over our lifespan. But for those that are visiting our area or moving to our area for the first time, certainly doesn't come naturally, so to speak.
That's great. I apologize. There was a question that was posed by someone about the Rural Ontario Institute's dashboards and asking for a hyperlink. I accidentally clicked the wrong button, but I did stick the response into a different question, the one that Carissa just posed. But Ellen, I wondered if you might just give a blurb about what people might find in that dashboard. As the individual had asked how to get access to them, I pointed them to the ROI webpage, but maybe you could just give a quick highlight of what's in there. A sneak peek for folks that might be interested.
Thank you for asking. We worked long and hard, probably a couple of years now, to develop this quite comprehensive repository of data. It starts with Stats Canada data. It's called the Rural Community Wellbeing Dashboard. You can find it on our website, ruralontario.ca, under the Wellbeing tab. And so the sort of the base data is StatsCan. So you get your demographics and your geographies, and everything's there. You can filter right down to your community. But we've also been able to acquire data sets from 9 other sources, including mental health data, long-term care data, arts and culture data, eco footprint data. So climate change data. There's sort of there's a whole sort of the different indicators that you can sort of research on that dashboard, and then sort of do some comparisons. You can compare your small community to your neighboring community. It's a bit of a benchmarking tool. And you know, if you're looking to do your community profile or to really dig deep into some of the dynamics happening in your rural community, it's a useful tool. And our data manager is happy to meet with folks to walk them through. And if it doesn't come easily to you working through a dashboard, she certainly can meet with you and help you find the things you need. Does that answer okay?
I think it does a lot, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a few folks that are also multitasking at the moment on the dashboard as they're listening in on this discussion.
Thank you. Can I ask a question, Ryan?
By all means.
Of the researchers, when you were presenting, Sarah and Christopher, when you were speaking about the findings in the study, could you speak a bit to regional results going on? Like I'm GTA, I'm above the GTA, but it really impacts where I live. So I'm just north of Orangeville, but what, like you said, Northwestern Ontario saw the migration, and other regions. Could you speak a little bit more about that? Who felt it the most, I guess, is my question. What area?
So maybe from the survey results, I can note quickly, and then I'll pass it to Chris. That's the next part of the analysis, is doing the regional piece to see the differences in the survey responses, and then from that, case studies across Ontario as well. So that's sort of the next step of the survey analysis. So we haven't done that quite yet, but I think Chris will probably be able to provide some other insight into some of the stuff he was looking at.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Absolutely. Like I said before, it was definitely a province-wide phenomenon. Not surprisingly, it did have a bit of what we would call a distance decay to it, where the closer the rural community was to an urban center, the more likely it got the biggest influx of people. But generally it was literally across the board. So whether it was, you know, Muskoka up in central Ontario, for example, the township of Georgian Bay went up by 36.9% in 5 years, from 2,500 to over 3,400. Blue Mountains up Scott's Way, town of the Blue Mountains went from 2016 population of 7,025 to a 2021 census number of 9,390, which is again over 30%. And then if you, we're basically looking at things through the 4 different sub-districts of Ontario that Sara pointed out, because those coincide with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusinesses different districts. And so in Eastern Ontario, again, there were places ranging from, you know, in some of our snapshots here of 9 to 26% growth. And it's literally everywhere. It's not just town, you know, nucleated towns and villages. It's along rivers, it's along lakes, it's in cottage country, as we call it, the various cottage regions like the Kawarthas and Haliburton and of course Muskoka. Nobody was immune to these changes. It was quite incredible to see how broad it was. And I think, you know, a lot of it was driven because those are, of course, again, May 2021 numbers, so they don't give the full picture after that. But, you know, it just seems as though when the pandemic started and we all kind of, you know, I think it was St. Patrick's Day 2020, that was the first day we all had to stay home. By June, July of that year, is when you were seeing the housing market explode, the recreational property market explode. And, you know, lots of press coverage, talking to realtors, real estate agents and such. And it just seems as though, you know, there was this panic buying almost going on in some cases, beyond just, you know, sort of following through on the dream of moving to the country. A lot of people were just, you know, buying, you know, anything they could, anywhere they could, as long as it was away from the city and such. And I think they were, you know, in a lot of cases, you know, priced out of the nearer towns and villages, so they had to keep going, right? What's the expression? Drive till you qualify when it comes to mortgages and such. And it resulted in a pretty province-wide phenomenon.
Thank you. Thanks.
This is great. There are a few questions that are in the chat box. I'm going to propose that we tackle them all, but with maybe no more than a 90-second response, so that we get them all addressed. Michelle posed a question asking if there was any indication that an increase of urban to rural movements has corresponded to charitable donations increasing in rural areas. Does anyone have any answer to that in terms of, do we see rural charities increasing their donations or receiving more donations from urban residents? Go for it, Scott.
I don't know. This is more anecdotal. I will say if there has been an increase, it's perhaps been offset by the increase in need. And I know locally here, certainly in terms of the numbers of meals served at local sort of soup kitchens or shelter type organizations, those skyrocketed during the pandemic. And some of the provincial and federal benefits helped for a while. But as some of those have gone out, the need has just increased. So if there has been an increase in charitable donations, I would say it's maybe been sadly outpaced by the need in our communities.
Thanks for that. And I know from some of the research that we've been doing on a different project, it builds into that sense of place and sense of attachment. If urban residents that are moving into rural areas don't have that sense of attachment or sense of place, it impacts the likelihood that they will donate to local charities or local nonprofits. Quickly going to some of the other questions, maybe I can turn to Sara and to Chris. Did the study look at the impact on health services from an urbanites moving into rural? Was that a topic that emerged in either the survey or newspapers in a minute or less?
Ooh,
So sorry.
Thanks for that, Ryan. It did come up in the survey. There was a question about access to healthcare, and the commentary was that it was more limited during the pandemic. During the 2020 to 2022 timeframe, access was incredibly limited. There was a note about increased demand from urban residents. There's also been closures, though, in many rural communities of some of the health services. So again, I don't want to correlate between timing and different things and say everything is because of the pandemic and migration, but it certainly came up. And I think that's one of the questions we'll tease out in those case studies to find out, like, is there a correlation, or is this the timing simply overlapped?
Yeah, just to add to that, Sarah touched on it. I mean, basically, once we get into our case study phase, which will probably start at around April, where we go into selected communities to do key informant interviews with planners, local health officials, local government members of local government, that sort of thing. That will be one set of the questions we look at. And it gives us the benefit of one more year since the survey. By then, it'll be almost a year since the survey was first put out. So, you know, we can get a longer term perspective on those types of issues, like access to healthcare, pressure on healthcare in an area that's already perhaps suffering from doctor shortages and other healthcare shortages and such. So yeah, it will be part of the research.
Great. Sandy posed a wonderful question that I'm going to suggest that we actually encourage Gateway to create a whole lecture just on that topic, Sandy, which was around exploring the issues of how rural folks may not be welcoming to newcomers, and how spending multiple years in a rural community may not qualify you as being from the place, and the impacts that that has. It is a wonderful conversation. I think an hour should be devoted at least to that. So with your permission, Sandy, we'll pass that along to the Gateway organizers as possibly a topic for an upcoming lecture series on that front. We are about 4 minutes from top of the hour. The time has quickly disappeared. This has been a fascinating conversation. Maybe just one word from yourself, Sarah, in terms of some next steps. And there was a question also around how can municipalities get more of this type of information? Maybe if you could address that in a minute, and then we'll do a quick wrap up.
Perfect. So next steps are finalizing those results of the survey. So getting an understanding of the different geographic sort of trends that we were seeing across the province, sharing that as broadly as possible, and then our case studies and our findings and recommendations and reports and all that fun stuff. What that looks like for us, though, is direct outreach. So we will go back to anyone who participated in the survey. They had an opportunity to share their contact information so that we could share results. So that will be directly shared as much as possible. We will blanket wherever we can the news outlets or media sources, or however we can share information to make sure it gets out there. The last thing any researcher wants is for our reports to sit on a shelf somewhere. So we will try to push those out as much as possible, and are happy to share with any of these outlets, such as Gateway as well.
Thanks for that, Sarah. Well, perhaps with that in mind, maybe I could encourage everybody that has joined us today to pass along a huge thank you to our presenters, Sarah, Chris, Ellen, Scott. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've learned lots along the way and have taken copious notes here on my end. Before we jump off, though, a few things to mention. One is that we'd really like to thank the sponsors who make these Gateway lectures possible. Without them, it wouldn't be possible to have these engaging conversations. So to McGee Motors, Hurontel, DeJager's Pharmacy, the CIBC Wealth Management, Liberal Credit Union, and Tucker Smith Communications, a sincere thank you for your support towards Gateway and making these possible. The next lecture series, as you can see on your screen, will take place on March 4th at the same time. The focus will be on rural recreation and activities, so do join to hear colleagues Kyle Rich and others share their information. I also wanted to share that Gateway Center for Excellence for Rural Health is a nonprofit organization with charitable status. And if you're really enjoying these lecture series and other activities that they've got on the go, please do feel free to join or take a look at the Canada Helps webpage and consider making a donation to Gateway to allow them to continue to do these activities. So again, thank you to all of our panelists, the sponsors. Thank you to everybody else that has joined us throughout the afternoon. It's been a wonderful discussion, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So take care, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.